I first played Dark Souls in 2015. My best friend got me a copy of the game on PlayStation 3 for my birthday. I was immediately hooked, though, like most people starting out, I had great difficulty actually getting anywhere. I would estimate I spent roughly 5 hours just wandering around the first few areas of the game. Nonetheless, I was enthralled. The world was unlike anything I had ever experienced in the game up to that point, and the combat was hard but incredibly rewarding. I was obsessed with the lore, and somewhere around the halfway point of the game, I distinctly remember thinking, this is the best game I have ever played. Immediately after I beat Dark Souls, I ordered a copy of Dark Souls 2, Scholar of the First Sin. I remember checking the mailbox every day after school, hoping and praying it would be there. When it finally arrived, on a Friday, fortuitously, I binged the game all weekend. The game was beautiful. I spent hours just sitting in Majula, idly listening to the music. I loved the bosses, most of them anyway, and I thought the world was compelling, especially as I learned more about King Vendrick and how he was seduced by the Abyss. My playthrough of the DLC was especially enjoyable. It took everything good about the base game and ramped it up massively. I loved the game to such a degree that, sometime during my attempts at beating Sur alone hitless, I distinctly remember thinking, this is the best game I have ever played. By the time I was done with Dark Souls 2, it was March of 2016, just in time for the release of Dark Souls 3. I got the game on release, I still have my Day 1 edition sitting on the shelf, and once again, I binged the game. I stayed up all night and just skipped school the following day. The world was distinct from the previous two games. It felt more decayed, more somber than the worlds of the other two. The combat was far better than the other entries, objectively speaking, and the bosses were some of the best the series had to offer. It paid tribute to the previous games, although it definitely acknowledged Dark Souls 1 more than Dark Souls 2, and it wrapped the series up beautifully. This all culminated, of course, in the final boss, the Soul of Cinder, a stunning homage in both gameplay and lore to the series as a whole. As I finally got him to Phase 2 and heard those three iconic piano notes, I distinctly remember thinking, this is the best game I have ever played. I've since gone back to each game countless times. I've done different builds, I've done challenge runs, I've done hundreds of hours of PvP, and I've noticed an odd trend. Each time I start a playthrough of one of these games, I inevitably think, this is the best Dark Souls game. I know the title of Best Souls Game is a hotly disputed topic in the community, and so in this video I want to offer a different perspective. I've come to believe that every Souls game is the best one. I think that the three games combined offer a cohesive and beautiful narrative about the consequences of one man's hubris, and this narrative would be far weaker without the presence of any one of the games. Each game offers such a distinct experience that it leads to a greater appreciation of the other games, a sort of recursive loop that has led to this series being one of my favorite experiences of all time. Dark Souls released in 2011 to critical acclaim. It was preceded by 2009's Demon's Souls, but that was a relatively niche title at the time. Dark Souls, on the other hand, quickly became a cultural phenomenon. You couldn't talk about difficulty in games without hearing the phrase Dark Souls at least once in the conversation. It's not an exaggeration to say that difficulty and Dark Souls became largely synonymous. Looking past the game's difficulty, though, I think one of the most impressive things about Dark Souls is its world map. Never before, and not since, have I seen such a beautifully interconnected world in a game. It feels like a real medieval location, rather than something created specifically for a video game. I've never been so immersed in a game as I was during that first adventure in Lordran. The underlying narrative of Dark Souls is especially fascinating to me. While you play as the Chosen Undead, you really don't play all that large a role in the story. Ultimately, the story revolves around Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight. Gwyn harnessed the power of the first flame to create a world for himself, and when the flame started to fade, as all flames must do, Gwyn resisted the natural order of events by throwing himself into the fire so it could keep burning. This isn't quite made explicit in the game until the very end, though. I feel like the story of Dark Souls is so well known by this point that many people don't consider just how powerful it really is. Imagine, for a moment, that you are playing Dark Souls for the first time, completely blind. You watch the opening cutscene and learn about Gwyn's role in the war against the immortal dragons and his creation of Lordran. You learn that the fire is fading, but that's about it. Through item flavor text, you might learn about Gwyn's failed attempts to sustain the fire. The key factor here, though, is that you never learn what happened to Gwyn, just that he went to link the fire. On your first playthrough though, you likely don't know what that means or what it entails. Even when you're told that you must link the fire, you probably chalk it up to a narrative hook made to keep you playing. Then, at long last, you arrive at the kiln of the first flame. You go in expecting to fight Gwyn, a dramatic clash with the god of this world, and as you walk through the fog, you are greeted with this. This, for me, is the most powerful moment of Dark Souls. As you enter the boss arena, as Gwyn lunges mindlessly at you as you read the boss's name, Lord of Cinder, you realize that Gwyn may have extended the Age of Fire, but at the cost of himself. He is no more sane than any of the countless hollows you've slaughtered throughout your journey. He even resembles a hollow in appearance. As you put Gwyn down, you might realize that maybe linking the fire isn't all that great of an idea. But, canonically, the Chosen Undead does so anyway, leading us straight into Dark Souls 2. Dark Souls 2 originally released in 2014, with its re-release Scholar of the First Sin debuting in 2015. I'm going to be talking about Scholar in this video, as it is the most relevant to the series as a whole, and is generally taken as the more canon of the two editions of the game. Upon release, Dark Souls 2 was met with criticism for everything, really. People didn't like the graphics, they didn't like the life gem system, they didn't like the combat. Really, it'd be faster to list the things that people were happy with. Even when Scholar of the First Sin fixed many of these problems, it was still looked down on, and many people consider the game to be the black sheep of the series to this day. And look, I'm not here to argue that Dark Souls 2 is a perfect game or anything. None of these games are. I am here to argue, though, that Dark Souls 2 is just as good as the other entries in the series. Dark Souls 2 innovated in many key ways on its predecessor. First, its combat was far more robust than the combat of the first game. The most obvious example of this is power stancing, a mechanic unique to Dark Souls 2 that gives weapons new movesets if the player wields two of them with high enough stats. The sheer variety of weapons and spells is also the highest in the series, and the magic, as a whole, is far more viable and fun in Dark Souls 2 than at any other point in the series. I'm also fascinated by the world, which is admittedly not as tightly connected as the world of Dark Souls 1, but it paints a vivid picture of the Kingdom of Drangleic nonetheless. Though Dark Souls 2 is often compared to the other games in the series as a way to put it down, I think it stands on par with them in just about every way that matters, and this includes the narrative. Narratively, Dark Souls 2 is often looked over, a precedent that was in large part established by Dark Souls 3. This is a shame. I think that the core narrative, a tale of the seduction and betrayal of King Vendrick by Nashandra, daughter of the Abyss, is quite compelling in its own right. Even setting that narrative aside, though, I think Dark Souls 2 is a key part of the trilogy's story, thanks to one character in particular, Aldia, the titular scholar of the First Sin. Aldia's importance to the series cannot be overstated. It's Aldia who introduces what I would argue is the series' core thesis. The endless cycle of linking the First Flame must be stopped, but it cannot be stopped in any meaningful way. Now, I know what you're thinking. Surely Dark Souls 1 started the concept of this cycle, and certainly the implication is there at the end of the game. If a literal god throwing himself into the fire didn't make it last forever, what hope do you have? Dark Souls 2 makes the cyclical nature explicit though, and it further argues that, even had the Chosen Undead not linked the fire, the world would be trapped in this cycle nonetheless. This is because Gwyn, when he usurped the natural order and linked the flame, irrevocably broke the world and bound it to an endless repetition of light and dark. This is the first sin that Aldia studies. I've seen a take on Dark Souls 2 that I find quite compelling, if a little out there, so bear with me. Anyone who's played these games or engaged with the series has undoubtedly heard complaints of the nature of the world map of Dark Souls 2, and how nonsensical it is relative to the first game. The most infamous example of this is the elevator from Harvest Valley to Iron Keep. Ride the elevator up from the top of a windmill and you end up at a lake of lava. Now, obviously this is impossible from a geographical standpoint, but I think it can be interpreted as a sign that the world is wrong. Drangleic was never meant to exist. It exists only because of the First Sin. This is a world that is well beyond its expiration date, one that never should have been created in the first place. The seemingly random changes in environment, the frankly nonsensical references to the first game, and the oddly distant nature of it all could well be signs that this world is akin to a dream, one that refuses to end. And let's be honest, do I think that the developers went into the creation process with this intent in mind? No, absolutely not, but the beauty of art lies in our ability to interpret it, especially in the context of surrounding works. Aldia himself refers to the entirety of the kingdom of Drangleic, of the game itself, as a tender and exquisite lie, a facade put on by the first flame to cover up the fact that it was not meant to exist. With Dark Souls 2, we're given a clear direction for the series to take. The cycle cannot be allowed to continue. In Scholar of the First Sin, you are asked by Aldia what it is you want. Light, dark, or something else entirely. The canon ending sees you choose something else, and walk away from the first flame. And yet, the flame persists, and the Age of Fire continues on, and that takes us all the way to Dark Souls 3. Dark Souls 3 came out in 2016, once again to critical acclaim. Fans hailed it as a return to form for the series, which is an amusing thing to say for something that has only had 2 entries up to this point. It was faster and more fluid than its predecessors and had some of the best boss fights in video game history. It seemed, for all intents and purposes, that this was the pinnacle of the series mechanically. On the other hand, it did receive some criticism for being what I would effectively call nostalgia bait. Items, characters, even full areas from the previous titles show up seemingly without explanation. It's as if Dark Souls 3 is saying, hey, remember this? This was especially obvious with the final boss, the soul of Cinder, whose Phase 2 is a very blatant callback to Gwyn. Regardless of whether or not this works narratively, and it absolutely does in my opinion, it was certainly a heavy-handed callback to the first game, a way of saying, yep, this is a sequel to Dark Souls. But here's the thing. I think Dark Souls 3 very intentionally calls back to its predecessors, not as a cheap way to keep veterans of the series engaged, but as a cry for help, a way of begging for the player to just let the world rest. Much like Dark Souls 2, the architecture of the world of Dark Souls 3 is nonsensical. Areas from previous games show up without reason, just sort of crammed together seemingly at random. This culminates in the Dreg Heap, the first area of the game's second and final DLC, which consists of buildings smashed into one another in a giant heap. This is a consistent theme of the game's world design. Even when something familiar shows up, it is very clearly run down, broken, and hollow. The world is, for lack of a better word, dying. And sure, this could just be an excuse for the developer to shove nostalgic locales in our faces, but I think there's a very intentional statement being made here. I think the most telling example of this is in the Link the Fire ending for Dark Souls 3. Whereas in the first game, linking the fire resulted in a blinding explosion of light, here your character just sits down and gently catches on fire as the screen fades to black. Even if you choose to prolong the Age of Fire, you are greeted with darkness, with a quiet desire for everything to just stop. Dark Souls 3's final DLC, The Ringed City, takes this narrative theme to its logical endpoint. The final boss of the DLC sees you fighting against Slave Knight Gael at the end of time in an arena that is literally nothing but ash and ruined buildings. This is the end result of an endless Age of Fire. This is what Gwyn apparently wanted, a world drawn out for so long that it ceased to exist. Clearly, by this point, there is nothing left worth saving, and yet we fight on anyway. This is one of the key themes of the series, in my opinion, persistence in the face of nihilism. And perhaps one of the best examples of this is Gael himself. Gael is a slave knight, a being that has been around since the very beginning of the first game. He has seen kingdoms rise and fall, he has quite literally seen everything. And Gael's role in the narrative is to become the new host of the Dark Soul, which was scattered amongst all of humanity. Now, at the end of time, he has realized that goal and holds almost all of the Dark Souls save for one piece, the players. However, Gael was collecting the Dark Soul for a very specific reason. He wanted the player to kill him and give his blood, now tainted with the Dark Soul, to a girl who could use it to paint a new world to escape to, one free of the cycle of light and dark. In this way, I think Gael is the epitome of the series' themes. Here is a man who saw everything, saw the inevitable nature of the world's decay, and chose to fight for a better future anyway. Ultimately, this overarching narrative is why I believe every Dark Souls game is the best one. They each have their distinct quirks that may subjectively make them better or worse than the others in the eyes of a particular person, but each game is an integral part of one of the most powerful narratives I've ever seen in a game. Without Dark Souls 1, we wouldn't have the beginning of this story. We wouldn't have Gwyn and his hubris setting these events in motion. We wouldn't have the opportunity to put the Lord of Cinder down and begin to correct things. Without Dark Souls 2, we wouldn't get a sense of the bigger picture. Aldia wouldn't be able to inform us of the impossibility of fixing things on our own. We wouldn't learn of the option to walk away from the cycle entirely. And without Dark Souls 3, we wouldn't see the endpoint of the cycle. We wouldn't see the ashen ruins of the world. We wouldn't be able to defeat Gael and use his blood to paint a new world, one that is free of Gwyn's influence entirely. By painting this world, we accomplish what Aldia set out to do. We choose something else entirely, and we wrap up what is, in my estimation, one of the best trilogies ever created.